The Dragan Skocic era has been going on for a long time. But unfortunately for us Team Melli football fans, there's only one game to talk about, and that was a recent 2-1 victory over Iran's favorite opponent. You guessed it, Uzbekistan. For today's edition, I am joined by Kiarash Mahtavi, my co-host, and also first-time guest on Team Melli Talk, Pasha Gerami. First, Kiarash, good to have you on the show. How you doing?
Thank you, Arash. I'm doing very well. Nice to meet you and Pasha as well. Thanks for having me on this new episode of Team Melli Talk. I'm happy to contribute this time around. I'm looking forward to a good discussion about Team Melli's recent performance and the development of our players.
Thank you, Kiarash. And of course, like I said before, we have our first-time guest. His first time on Team Melli Talk. His name is Pasha Gerami. Claims that he is an expert in Iranian football. Pasha, welcome to Team Melli Talk. Really glad to have you on the show. Tell us a bit about your history as a fan of Team Melli.
Thanks, Art John. I appreciate it. Thank you, Kiarash. It's really a pleasure to sit with both of you here virtually via Zoom. First of all, I hope everyone is safe during these times. I've been a huge Team Melli fan for the longest time. I'm 24 years old. I've been watching them since 2003. I told you previously, the first game I watched of Team Melli was Iran-Syria in the 2003 WAF Cup, and that was held in Iran, and Iran won that game 4-1. The funny thing is, I can't find that video online anywhere. So I'm kind of deprived of my first Team Melli memory, sadly. But yes, I'm a huge fan. I'm a huge fan of the show. I think the vision is great. So once again, thank you, Art. Thank you, Kiarash.
I'd like to hear. I'm really impressed to hear about your details. I mean, the WAF, West Asian Football Federation Championship. Never was too big a fan of that, to be honest, from my point of view. But there's also, we know there's a Central Asian Football Association. They're supposed to be having some kinds of tournaments, but, what can we say? It just doesn't really exist anymore. But on top of with that, the two teams that were basically, I think, mostly involved in the, Central Asian Football Association, Iran and Uzbekistan, these are the teams that just always have great football relations, we can say. And with that, let's just get to that recent friendly match that Iran played. It was a 2-1 victory for Iran over Uzbekistan. That was played in Tashkent. And when looking back at that, of course, I'm thinking about the formation. And also, for one, that was Dragan Skocic's first game as head coach of Iran. I mean, it took a long time, for obvious reasons. We know that. Now, in that match, Iran's starting lineup, Payam Niazman was in goal. And as for the defenders, the wingbacks, of course, were Milad Mohammadi and Sadef Moharami. The two center backs, Hossein Kanani Zadegan and Shoja Khalilzadeh. As for the midfielders, Ahmad Nurullahi, Ehsan Hajsafi, and Ali Golizadeh. Of course, on the wings, there was Mehdi Taremi and Vahida Amiri, and up top, Sardar Azmoun. So a 2-1 victory for Iran. Goals were scored by Sardar Azmoun late in the first half, a penalty from Mehdi Taremi early in the second half. And let's not forget that Iran conceded the goal very quickly after Taremi's goal. So having said all that, first let me start with you, Pasha. I know I'm putting you on the spot. It's your first time on the show, so you have to expect it. Now, did you like how Iran looked on the pitch against Uzbekistan in terms of ball movement and teamwork?
Well, I would say Skocic has his work cut out for him. I think he played well. I think Iran played well. I think he did a good job of being the manager that we need after the Wilmots fiasco. And, against Uzbekistan, I thought we played decently. There were some issues, I think, that are not necessarily apparent just in this game, but in previous games, and that's the void in the midfield. Iran's midfield was absolutely non-existent. I'm sure Kiarash would agree. It was very disappointing to see. But like I said, this isn't an issue that just arose. This is something that even Carlos Queiroz had to deal with. And only at the end of his tenure was he able to transform Iran's midfield into a formidable relatively European-esque style midfield. So I think the results, getting a 2-1 victory away from home against Uzbekistan is impressive nonetheless. But that's what we should be always expecting. We should always be expecting to win against Uzbekistan. But there were a lot of things that needed to be mended. I think the midfield is the primary one, and also the defense.
All right, of course, talking about the defense, I'll be quick to say, well, we look back at the center backs, Hossein Kanani and Shoja Khalilzadeh. Iran has been dealing with injuries and other inconveniences. So I think it's safe to say we know that those two players are not the set in stone starting center backs. But Kiarash, same question for you. I mean, did you like what you saw from Team Melli against Uzbekistan?
Well, first of all, I think Pasha's analyses are very well taught. But for me personally, it was hard to have any expectation of how Team Melli will perform after a year of not playing any games. With this in mind, I was pleasantly surprised by how they did on the field. We looked a bit sharper than on the real mats, so okay, we face a relatively decent Uzbek side. Seems to me that we used a more offensive 4-3-3 formation, which underlies that Skocic may want to transform us into a more attacking side. With Azmoun and Taremi up front, and to mention something about what Pasha earlier said about the lacking creativity in the midfield. I think that he started Golizadeh because he sees in him a creative player that can open up tight spaces and can give us the needed creativity that we lack in the midfield area. So overall, I think this is a good development that he starts him, and he did well against Uzbekistan. And I think it's also good that he wants to focus on the offense because our talent level is very high up front. We're stacked with good players playing in decent European leagues. So overall, I'm satisfied, although there are plenty of points we could further work on under Skocic.
And with that, you did mention Ali Golizadeh, Kiarash. My next question is, which player were you most impressed with, for Iran in the game against Uzbekistan? Was it Golizadeh or was it someone else?
Well, I just mentioned Golizadeh, obviously. Would like to elaborate a bit further. He was responsible for creating the attacks and finding the spaces between the Uzbek defense. And I think for that reason and his recent good performances for Khalilzadeh, he's pushing for a starting spot, competing with Jahanbakhsh, who has been more or less injured for Brighton, unfortunately. When I look to the remaining qualifiers, I think he can be our man on the wing, but also on the midfield, especially against Bahrain, who are pretty well in defending, will sit deep. Therefore, yeah, I think Skocic should start him.
Okay, Pasha, your turn now. Which player were you most impressed with in the win against Uzbekistan?
Well, I agree with Kiarash. I think Ali Golizadeh was our man of the match. He was the creative spark that we needed. He got stuck in as well defensively, which is great for a guy who, physically doesn't look that imposing. He's a skinny guy. He's relatively short, but he got stuck in defensively, and I like that. And he did help create a lot of chances for Iran. But I'd also like to mention Sadegh Moharrami. I thought that he also played well. Overall, I think most of the players did not have the most impressive performances. But as Kiarash rightly mentioned, this was the first game we played in quite a while, so it's tough to have too many high expectations. But in general, I think Golizadeh was vital for us. I'm still not sure if, we should keep him as a cam, that creative central midfield type, or, have him drift off on the wings like he does for his club. Personally, I think he's more of a winger, but against Uzbekistan, he showed certainly that he can play, at least against certain opposition in the attacking midfield position. I think it was also good that both of our strikers scored. We want our strikers to be scoring goals. I think Azmoun was assertive. He actually, it seems like he's shooting the ball more from distance. And to be honest, some of his shots are not amazing, but at least he's shooting. and that's great. And Taremi, he got that penalty. I don't think it was his best game, but he did get the penalty and he scored. So I think that's good for the strikers on the team. But overall, Ali Golizadeh is the man of the match for me.
Okay, so talking about the positives, now I got to talk a bit about the negatives. Which player, I'm going to stay with you on this one, Pasha, which player were you not impressed with from Team Melli in the match against Uzbekistan?
So, I think it'd be very easy for me to pick on Peyman Yozmand, the goalkeeper. Obviously, he was a debutant for the national team against Uzbekistan. It was interesting for me to see him because while I was watching the game on my computer, I thought that he looked pretty confident. He was calm. His demeanor seemed like, he was ready to play, but his actions were not indicative of that. I thought that he was shaky. The goal that we conceded was a very soft goal. I was looking back at that goal a couple of times, and I was disappointed in his reaction. And then there was another scene where he, instead of punching the ball, he sort of deflects the free kick onto our own crossbar post area. So I thought that was not the best. And I think had the Mali game went on, we would have seen Obidzadeh play in that match. And had we known that the Mali game would have been canceled, I think maybe Skocic would have played Obidzadeh in the first place, who's been amazing. But I don't think Peyman Yozmand was the worst player on the pitch. For me, that was Ehsan Hajsafi. The reason why I say that is because, well, he's been playing for the national team since he was a teenager under Ali Daei. He has so many caps. He's the quasi-captain of the team, and I just don't think he can play the center mid position well unless we have those components next to him, like Said Izzatullahi, for example. By himself, I think Hajsafi is just not good enough to play in that role. But I'm not a Hajsafi hater. He's a utility player, and I think he's a good guy to have on the squad.
Really like the explanation there. You, of course, took some of the words out of my mouth. I'll get to that in a bit. But Kiarash, your turn. Who was your player that you were not very impressed with against Uzbekistan?
Well, I'm going to say Ehsan Hajsafi as well. Just because when we talk about experience, he has over 100 caps. I personally expect more from him, especially responsibility on and off the pitch. But something that worries me is his defensive abilities. Like Pasha said, he's an utility player. He can play as a central midfielder, but he can also play as a left back. And ladder something, which is not his strength, although Carlos Queiroz played him a lot. On the left back side, we have seen some games where his defensive abilities led to direct goals on our left side. So when you look at his age and his situation in his career, I think he's in the fall of his career. He has been over 30 years of age. And I think Skocic can try to phase him out. But like Pasha also said, he can be a useful player. For me, he could be a squad player in the locker room for the younger boys to use the experience he has to teach them how to stay calm in the pitch. So yeah, completely removing him from the squad seems to be too harsh. And I mean, he has 100 caps, so he can still be useful and contribute to Team Melli, just like Sujai did at the World Cup and at the Asian Cup.
From my point of view, is that when I look back at that game, I remember seeing Ehsan Hajsafi and Vahida Amiri giving the ball away on a few occasions. And, of course, when we bring in things in perspective about how it's been a long time since Iran has played, I know there's a lot of things we could say, but I'm still going to just be, straight into the point, is that it does bother me to see Hajsafi and Amiri giving the ball away. So I would say for my worst players, for the player I wasn't impressed with from that match against Uzbekistan, I'm definitely also going with Ehsan Hajsafi. And, before the 2018 World Cup, a lot of people thought that Vahida Amiri was not going to make the final cut. And he actually impressed so many with his performance at the World Cup. So my question now for you, this little follow-up question is, do you think Vahid Amiri still has a place on Iran? I mean, do you think he should be called up, or do you see him more as a player who should be coming off the bench? Kiarash, I'll start with you.
Well, I think he was more of a one season wonder, of maybe if you can call it one tournament wonder, because yeah, Carlos K was transformed it into a very useful player. Just one of Carlos Creo's main abilities to transform domestic players into world beaters, as we all have seen. But I mean, he only lasted one season at Trabzonspor, was mainly a substitute. And when you look at his recent performance, I think that we have many other alternatives that are willing to grab Amiri's spot. Although he has a stamina and work rate which are really unmatched for Iranian standards. So if we really need to beat opponents based on stamina, I think he can be a useful player to bring in late on the game, but definitely not as a starter.
Okay, Pasha, how about your input on Vahid Amiri?
Well, I agree with Kiarash. I think that he is a guy that we can definitely keep on the team as a rotational player. He has the iron lung trait. Like in FIFA, he has the iron lung trait, and he can last even 120 minutes. We've seen this numerous times for Iran, but I also understand your sentiments, Art, because it's frustrating to see him lose the ball all the time. But again, I think he's the type of guy, if he's going to be playing on the national team, he has to have the components next to him so that we can really see the best of Vahid Amiri. I don't think he's the guy who should be facilitating our attacks per se. He can, but he's not the guy we should be relying on. But is he someone that can come in the 70th minute and run his behind off? Yes, certainly. I think that he's a good guy to still have, at least for now. I think it's important for us to take into consideration that time is of the essence. We don't have too much time, unfortunately. We have to get the results we need quickly against these four teams. So I don't think it would be good to phase out some of these guys right now, like Hajsafi or Amiri. But hopefully if we can get out of this group, we can start thinking about alternatives.
We are getting closer to wrapping up this edition of Team Melli Talk. And before we get to our final question, just for me, I'll just go ahead and share the player that I was most impressed with. I guess I got to go with Ali Golizadeh because I like his creativity, his dribbling skills, and his speed. And the player, naturally, that I was not most impressed with, of course, was Ehsana Hajsafi. And, of course, for all our viewers, our audience, go ahead, leave a comment down below. Who were you most impressed with in the win against Uzbekistan? And who were you not impressed with in that same game that took place in Tashkent? Now, to finish things off with our final question, are you confident in Iran moving forward with Dragan Skocic? I mean, let's face it, there's been a lot of doubters, but there's been a lot of negative energy directed at Team Melli's camps, at Skocic himself. Some people have said that he wasn't even that successful of a coach in the Iranian Pro League with teams that he coached with, whether it was Sanat Naft Abadan. He also had a stint with Fulad and Hune Behune and even Malevan in Bandar Anzali. So I'm going to go ahead and start with you, Pasha. I mean, are you confident in Iran moving forward with Dragan Skocic?
Well, that's a really tough question for me to answer because my heart is with the national team. I really want them to progress. I love Team Melli. I think every Iranian does. But I also want to be as objective as possible too. Skocic is not the best coach we could possibly have, but is he a step or two or three up from Wilmot? Certainly. I think it's important to look at circumstances around Iran too. Iran as a country isn't in very good shape, so it's hard for me to expect the national team during this time to be stellar and be able to qualify from this group. And lastly, just to add on to that, I think we're playing against a couple of teams, Cambodia and Hong Kong. I think no matter what, we should beat them. But Bahrain and Iraq, are tough. And, you know, Iraq especially has been so difficult for us to break down in the past 5-6 years. So unfortunately, my heart does say yes, but my mind, not so much. I don't think we're going to make it out of this group.
Okay, Kiarash, same question for you.
Well, that's a very tough question, like Pasha said. Well, let's see it objective. They won against Uzbekistan, but it's only one game. It's a friendly game. But I also heard that we have a friendly confirmed against Bosnia and Herzegovina. Well, I think that friendly game will give us more insight in Skocic's coaching abilities, since Bosnia has some solid players like Zeko, Pjanic, good players who can really give us a serious challenge. So I try to be more optimistic, but considering our difficulties with Iraq especially, I'm gonna agree with Pasha, and yeah, it will be very tough.
Well, it's time for us to wrap up this edition of Team Melli Talk. First, Pasha, just once again, like to thank you for taking the time to be on the show. It was great to have you.
Thank you, Art. I really appreciate it. And Kiarash, again, I appreciate it too. Thank you.
Kiarash, as always, good to have you on the show as well. And we'll see you on our next edition, right?
Yes, you're welcome. And thanks very much for having you both on the show.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this edition of Team LA Talk. You know what to do. Like, comment, share, subscribe. Hit that notification button. Go to our website, www.teammellitalk.com. You know where to find us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. You know the handle, @Team LA Talk. I'm your host, Artis Akhari. We'll see you next time.